Can you see the board work?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, you can't. Okay, good. Um,
The outer edges are the only parts that aren't necessarily in frame, but most everything is clear.
okay, I did send a picture of the board work in the East Coast Forum, if that'll help.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. All right. Okay, so this is the second time that I've presented this study. I have been reviewing it, revising it, adding, subtracting. It's a huge history. It was sparked by, I rewatched some months ago Elder Tess's study on contraception and abortion and from July 2022. And she mentioned the Comstock Act and then was connected to Roe v. Wade. So I was curious about the history. So how do we even get to the Comstock Act? So I decided to go back in American history and see what threads would be connected to that history. It's a complex history. It is not simple, and it was actually really overwhelming, the amount of information that's available. So I wanted to look at briefly an overview of what it was like for women in the early 1800s, the culture, the patriarchy, the medical system, and US policy. So I've tried to sift out the noise and just really kind of get the highlights. There is a lot more to the history than we can do in just one or two studies. So the focus is the United States. Clearly, every nation has their own history on contraception and abortion. But our focus is going to be the United States because of the Roe v. Wade and the United States as the glorious land. So I want to acknowledge my sources. Three main books. One is called Women, Race, and Class by Angela Y. Davis. She's a professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She was also and is still a feminist, an activist, and she was participated in second wave feminism. The other book is called The Moral Property of Women by Linda Gordon. And she's the Florence Kelley Professor of History at New York University. I did put Florence Kelley's name on the board. I looked up to find out who this person is, and she has quite an interesting biography and is a feminist activist from the late 1800s into the 1900s. So that's worth looking into. And then the other book is titled Abortion in America by James C. Moore, and he's the professor of history at the University of Maryland. So I gleaned from these books to try and weave a story that would bring us to 1873. So first, I want us to look at a quote from Linda Gordon in her book, and I'm going to find it. Okay. I was going to screen share. Let me get to screen share. Okay. So I'll read it and you can, I'll put it on the forum after the meeting. So this is an amazing quote that she wrote. Systems of sexual control change as women's status changes. They both reflect and affect each other. There is an especially strong connection between the subjection of women and the prohibition on birth control. The latter, the prohibition, has been a means of enforcing the former, which is the subjection. Inversely, there is a strong connection between women's emancipation and their ability to control reproduction. So in this study, we're going to see the various systems that control a woman's status and the subjection of women through the prohibition of birth control. So I'll go ahead and add, I can make a picture of that quote so you can have it to look at and get more meditation, because the more you think about it, the more it, how do I get that? Sorry. Okay. So basically, we're going to start in the 1800s. I wanted to see what was it like for women. How were they living? There's a system of control, and it was in the legal system, and it was called coverture. Coverture. And you can see the root word of it is cover. It's originally a French word, and it does mean to cover. So there was this man in England back in the 1700s. He was like the go-to guy for legal laws and the compilation and commentaries of laws. His name is William Blackstone, and he is still used and read in legal systems today. So this is what he says about coverture and the legal rights of married women. By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband, under whose wing, protection, and cover she performs everything, and is therefore called a femme couverte, which is in French, a covered woman. So you can see that legally, a woman's status doesn't exist. She has been enfolded into the being of her husband. Where do you think they got the husband and wife are one?
Scripture.
Yeah, they were influenced by the Bible. And the two shall be made one.
Can I ask a question while we're here at this word?
Sure.
because what comes to mind is your study of Ham and Canaan and the uncovering of Noah's nakedness and how that relates to the woman.
I couldn't answer that. I'd have to give that more thought.
That's why it was just the word similarity covering and all that.
Yeah. I don't know. I'd have to study that out. Yeah, no, I couldn't answer that without looking into it. Sorry. Okay, so I'm going to give a few details, specifics of what it meant to be under coverture. So the woman had no legal identity. At birth, she's covered by her father. At marriage, she's covered by her husband. At that time, rape was considered a property crime. So clearly, the woman has no status as a human being. She's property, right? From the father to the husband. A lot of these things we've been looking at through history and through other nations. But this gives us a picture of the life and times of women during the early 1800s. A symbol of subsuming to the identity of the husband is the woman taking the last name of her husband. Also, because legally a woman did not exist, she could not make contracts, she could not sue or be sued, and she could not work. Then let's also remember that there are classes of women. There's the wealthy, middle class, lower class, and the poverty. And the coverture was different for the different classes. If you were in poverty, the women worked. They had to, especially if the husband was unable to work or was not willing to work. She had to work. But generally, any wages a woman would make, the husband had claims to it. If a woman decided to divorce her husband because of abuse, she would lose all rights to her children. Married women had no rights to their bodies. The husband had absolute right to sexual access. And within the marriage, the consent by the wife was implied. And that consent meant anytime, anywhere. So under this law, all sexual activity, including rape, was legitimate. This law allowed men, husbands, to have total mastery over their wife, over this human being. It makes me wonder. Yes, Gloria.
When you say systems of sexual control changes as the status of women changes, so a higher status woman has no right to say how she wants to control her body either as the lower status?
I think that quote is referring to the status of equality, the level of equality. So the system that controls women the most means she has a lower status of equality and identity, not so much her class. Because the elites actually were very more strict with coverture and had much, they had more rules of behavior, especially when the Victorian era came in the mid 1830s. They had to abide by all of society's rules.
So women in the lower status, because they had to work, they had a little bit more freedom, you're saying, versus the higher status women. They were just trapped. under the
Yeah,
husband.
I don't think I'm trying to distinguish the classes from women's overall status as citizens or equal to men. But yes, if in the poor, they had to work. It doesn't mean that the husband still didn't have control over her, or he wouldn't, take her money, or if she divorced him, she'd lose her children. And certainly not every marriage was violent or was awful. But a good many took advantage of this system of control over women. And that's the point I'm trying to show, is that in the early 1800s, this is the confines of which women were living.
Thank you.
Okay. Also in coverture, the husband was allowed to beat his wife if she was unruly or for whatever reason. The only thing he couldn't do, well, he couldn't beat her to death. They drew the line there. Over time, coverture did erode. Generally around 1840s through the 1880s, there was legislation that was starting to work on these confinements of women. And for a few examples of the shadow of coverture in modern times, in the 1960s, men were the only one who could sit on a jury. Marital rape was still legal up until the 1980s. Women couldn't open a bank account without her husband's signature. I think it was in 1973 is when that changed. Same with a woman needed her husband's signature to open up a credit card account. And then this one really was surprising. Elected women officials, whether they be a congresswoman or a senator, were not allowed to wear slacks in Congress until 1993. I was just blown away by that. I'm like, are you kidding me? Really? Anyway, so the list goes on. We could come up with a bunch of others. We'll go ahead and move on. So in this time period, there's not a lot of medicine knowledge. They're just, learning about anatomy. Of course, they're always looking at the men anatomy and not the female anatomy. So they didn't really understand the reproductive organs of women. So what did women do when they missed their period, or young girls? What would they do if they missed it? So there were a lot of books that were like self-help medical books, especially for women who were in the rural area where there were no physicians or they couldn't afford a physician, and they would give them herbal remedies on how to unstop the blockage. There was a thinking at that time, I forget the term, but the body had flow. And so if you were not well, there was a blockage in that flow. And that's when they were still doing bloodletting, where they would cut you and let you bleed to help flush out the bad stuff. Now, of course, a lot of people bled to death. So there was a term in these books, and it was called the common cold or taking cold, and it literally was a euphemism for missing your period. And so some of the remedies was cutting the bottom of the foot, taking hot baths, taking herbal remedies that would cause severe lower digestive contractions and pain. Now, mind you, they still didn't connect that missing your period could be that you're pregnant. They were just going, okay, because they didn't know, they didn't have pregnancy tests and they hadn't connected all that yet. So you missed your period, you must have blockage, you do a remedy. There their main source of information were midwives. And so they would help them do this unblockage and give them assistance. There were herbal healers that traveled around. And of course, among those were quacks with their magic elixirs and things like that. So it was kind of dangerous. Plus, if you took too much of the herb or you took the wrong herb, you could literally poison yourself. And you may or may not survive. The doctors at the time admitted they could not distinguish between an early pregnancy and a blocked menstrual cycle. They just didn't have the means. And so what happened is the treatment for the blockage of your menstrual cycle was the exact same thing for inducing an abortion. And it was generally only until they took the herbal that they could then, depending on where they were in their pregnancy, that they had actually had an abortion. So this brings us to the next question. How did a woman know she was pregnant? There was no pregnancy tests. And so there was something called the quickening doctrine. And basically, it's when a woman feels the first movements of activity in her womb. And that standard had been in place for a long time. And that quickening was the, so you have your blocked menstrual cycle, you do the herbal to unblock your menstrual cycle, and then you find out, oh, I was pregnant. It was morally legal, and it was not an issue. That was not seen as an issue. Legal authorities at that time had not determined, well, they determined that quickening was the point of when the fetus was granted legal protection as a living human being. And generally, quickening happens during the gestation period around 4 or 5 months. So you're looking at 16 to 20 weeks. So if someone did take an herbal, they found out they were pregnant and they took an herbal after quickening, then they would be punished. But up until then, the general understanding was it's all go before the quickening. So another aspect of being in this time period for women's health was the absolute fear and horror of pregnancy. Because it was well known, you could die, or your baby could die, or you both could die from any kind of complication. And because there was no birth control, there was no understanding of how you got pregnant and prevention of pregnancy. Women basically many were just breeding and had awful experiences, and they could come out, if they survived, they could actually have infections, they could get a prolapsed organ, tears, all kinds of, I'm going to say, violent action in the process of giving birth that could really maim them, leave them in constant pain, have organ issues, and then sometimes turn around and end up getting pregnant again shortly thereafter. They did have women were women's helpers. So the midwives, the family members, all came together during that time to be with a woman so she would not have to go through this alone. Generally, the family member or friend would come and stay for a few months from the time of birth to help care for the woman, to care for the infant, to care for the household. It was a big deal, and they had a tight-knit community of sharing information, of helping each other. And this was women helping women. Generally, not too many men were involved in this process. And so that was a great comfort to a lot of women. In fact, one of their other fears was having to go through labor by themselves. At this time too, there was no medication to help with the labor pain. And sadly, another Bible verse was used to justify that pain, from Genesis. I think it's in 3. The curse of Eve and the punishment of having hard, you'll give birth in pain, something like that. So they felt that was perfectly normal because that's what the Bible said. Therefore, this is what you get to do. I think chlorophyll wasn't invented until around 1847. So in those early days, you were on your own pretty much. I have to admit that in the 70s, when I was pregnant, late 70s, there was this new trend of natural childbirth. I fell for that. So anyway, it's funny how things trend. So 1821 to about 1840, we start seeing U.S. policy on abortion to begin. Now, the abortion laws evolved around the doctrine of quickening. Why? Because the nation, men and women, everybody understood and had accepted that doctrine. It was fine. They were all okay with it. It wasn't wrong in the eyes of the vast majority of Americans, as long as it was accomplished before quickening. So that sounds similar to the today when they took the polls about abortion, and the majority of Americans were in agreement with abortion up to a certain point, but then after that, no. So this is what we have in the early 1800s. The doctors, they weren't too happy about the herbals or the purgatives because of dosage. If you do it wrong, you could hurt yourself. But they did feel that medically induced abortions were a reasonable risk. Again, as long as it was prior to quickening. So you have the U.S. population, men and women, accepting the quickening doctrine. The courts are accepting the quickening doctrine, and the doctors are accepting the quickening doctrine for now. So Connecticut was the first state that came out with a law that specifically said it banned medicinal abortion after quickening. They put it into codifying the law, and whoever provided the herbal to go through this procedure was given a life sentence, but the woman was immune from prosecution. So as one state goes, the other states follow over the years in this time period, and all of them were still using the quickening doctrine. Some would ban any method of abortion after quickening, some only medicinal, some would include instrumental abortion being banned. Some states actually started putting in an exception for the life of the mother. So we're in the 1820s. I forget the quote exactly. Maybe someone can remember. Ellen White made a comment about going to the doctor was just was like going to an attorney. Back then in the 1820s, doctors were really kind of a menace. They were not generally trained medically. They came from the elite families, were wealthy, had social status. 2/3 of them had not even graduated from medical school of any kind. There was also self-taught healers, folk wisdom, folk doctors. So it was really kind of a dangerous period. So people were doing the best they could. So because of that, there was an effort to try and create a safer environment for medical procedures. So there was something called the doctors would get together and they wanted to do medicine based on the scientific method. And so they wanted to distinguish themselves from the self-taught, from the people, the men who were not attending medical school, so they could separate, kind of sift out. So one of the things they discovered was in their medical school training that, and this is pivotal, they discovered that the quickening that had been so crucial for a long time was actually just a continuous process of development that would produce a human being if it was uninterrupted. So basically, it's just part of the gestation process. It wasn't the moment the fetus had life. They're now saying that it had life before you could feel it in the womb. And so they felt that if everyone believed it was immoral to have an abortion after the quickening, then their logic would be that it's immoral to do it before quickening. So they, as a group, these men were called regulars, to distinguish from the irregular doctors. So there was a backlash from the irregulars, and they protested and they continued offering abortions, whereas the regulars would no longer do it. They would not publicly advertise or accept women. And there were advertisements plastered everywhere in newspapers, in pamphlets, and on posters. So,
Kathy, I have a question. So when was that quickening time? When did it differentiate? How many months of a woman's pregnancy did they say it's okay to abort at that time?
It varied between 4 and 5 months, 16 to 20 weeks.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So now there's this conflict going on, competition between the regulars and the irregulars. And the regulars, who generally are from families of status, have education, have connections, decide to start to persuade legislators to make abortion a criminal offense. They felt that anti-abortion laws would weaken their competition. And they were interested in bringing abortion to the early stages, not just post-quickening. And so in their effort to control the practice of medicine, they kept dragging in abortion into the argument, into the limelight. So in 1827, New York passed a law declaring, quote, the unauthorized practice of medicine is a misdemeanor. So now the regulars had convinced legislators, look, we have two groups of doctors. You've got the medically trained through the scientific, which is good because there can be some quacks. And so now they're distinguishing and they're creating a medical standard, right? So then 1827, now it's a misdemeanor. Well, there was a huge backlash about from the irregulars about that. 30 to 40,000 people signed a petition. They were opposed to the rigid regulations of medicine in New York. So people really had a lot of freedom. They could self-medicate. They had the quickening doctrine. People were able to, and there were probably some good doctors that were not, quote, medically trained, but understood anatomy, etc. So later in the 1840s, another law, this time it was in Maine, and it says an attempted abortion of any woman pregnant with a child is an offense, whether the child is quick or not, and regardless of what method was used. This is the first strongest law regarding abortion, pre-quickening and post-quickening. And anyone who performed this procedure could face a year of jail and a $500 fine. If the child died, the abortion and the baby, you know, if they did not live, then the jail time was 5 years and a $1,000 fine. And they did include an exception for the mother's life if it was a crisis at the time. So a brief summary, and I hope this is, you can handle all this information. So a brief summary, between 1821 and 1840, abortion laws were not passed by themselves. You've heard of omnibus laws. It's where a group of laws and bills are put together and then they're passed as one. And so this is what was happening in the States. As more attention was given to abortion and the medical group was growing, doctors were getting more trained, more organized. It was basically a revision of criminal codes. There was no big outcry for anti-abortion activity. The public was not disapproving of the common law attitudes, which was up into the quickening period. The author from that book, Abortion in America, he could not find one legislator that would stand up and take a political stand on abortion, and that nowhere in Congress did he find that there was a literal abortion-only bill where legislators would cast their vote. The newspapers at the time were not interested in abortion. The religious press, they were just as detached. They were not interested. It was not an issue. But what happened was the criminal status of abortion, we're going to see, originates with doctors and lawyers. It was not a popular issue in any sense as far as the population. These laws were buried in codes of law, and they were hardly noticed and they were rarely enforced. So by 1841, the United States is still adhering to the basic tenets of common law tradition, which is the quickening doctrine. And at that time, 16 out of 26 states had passed no abortion laws, and the common law had stayed in effect. So a little side note here. 1830s, paper is a topic. It's amazing how I stumbled on this, and I just felt we needed to know about this, just like we had seen that telegraph and the train, the roads in Rome helped spread information. Well, paper was really expensive. It was made from linen fabric for thousands of years. And people started experimenting with paper, and cotton was added. And so then other products were used. And so the price of paper started falling dramatically. At the same time, there were people creating machines that would press and dry the paper. And instead of doing one sheet at a time, they could actually do a roll of paper that was 1,000 feet long and put it on a roll. This was all new. So that had an effect on how people could now publish books cheaper. You could publish newspapers cheaper, and more newspapers were published, more books were published, tracts and literature information was now affordable. And so information could be easily dispersed. However, the printing industry realized that most of Americans were illiterate. So what did they do? They created a reading program and published that and spread it around the country. So people who had not learned how to read were now learning how to read. This is what helped to spread and educate people on many subjects, but especially women's health and their reproductive health.
Kathy,
So, yes,
what year you said this was?
this was in the 1830s.
Oh, okay, 1830s. Thank you.
I just found that interesting. It was just, and of course, you have misinformation and true information, but it did have an impact because later on, as people would advertise services to help women unblock their menstrual cycle, and then outright advertising for abortion, then that took on another part of the doctors' campaign against abortion. So now we're going to come to 1847. And that's when the American Medical Association was founded. They wanted to create this regulated and group. They would have certifications, they would give licenses. It was a way to be able to monitor who was practicing medicine and if they were doing it correctly. Doing the licensing and the creating these rules and providing certificates was also a method of keeping people out, meaning the irregulars and midwives, because women can't be doctors. Women can't be doing health. So basically, over time, these doctors started making abortion a medical issue and could only be handled by the trained medical doctors, literally trying to take what was a woman's issue and a woman's work away from them. Basically saying, when a woman had the quickening that her testimony was not reliable or trusted. So we still have that today in some doctors. We all know that as women. So they would say, well, she could just be having gas. And so she really doesn't know. We need to have the doctors to, because they have this authority and they're trained and they know medicine better, that they're the ones that will determine exactly what's going on during the pregnancy. So they were basically distancing themselves from the more traditional female folk wisdom and how women treated their own bodies. So you can see the taking away of what they have had for centuries. Another system of control, the medical field. So another view of these doctors as they grew in number and they grew in power and they were all men, they recognized that there was a really healthy market of women's health care. And they knew it would have profits for them. So at the time, like I said before, if a woman was having any health issues, they generally would call the midwife first. And the goal of the doctors was to push the midwives out. And they did that by going after abortion because they were elevating themselves in the eyes of legislatures and the population, working to get this level of authority because they're the doctor, they've studied, they know, they have the answers. Why would a midwife who's not studied, there's no comparison. So they are separating that and stomping down the midwife and the knowledge that they have used over time.
So Kathy, that means that this is all about power, control, and capitalism. Really?
Pretty much. Yeah. And it's a system of control of women and their status. You can see what they've done. They're stamping down. The status of women is down. And the men are controlling, yes. They actually, I forget what year it was, it might have been 1853. They started they launched a criminalization campaign against abortion and female abortion providers. I think it was 1857. I have it on the board. But so as they grew in strength and in recognition by the population, legislatures would start moving to ban abortion. And what happens when you take something away? It goes underground. And this is what happened. Women would still call their midwife and it would go underground. The AMA would criticize the midwives as unsanitary and immoral. It was a literal campaign against these women, and these doctors were pushing for anti-abortion laws. And there was a man who was like the lead. His name was Horatio Storer, 1857. He started this campaign of physicians against abortion, but we'll go into that a little bit later. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions, any comments? I'm sorry, I'm keeping going. Okay, I'll go on. So the other thing that really was a thorn in the side of these regular doctors that were organizing and elevating their authority, elevating their status as the go-to, was that they were really ticked off that women could terminate their own pregnancies. They just found that just totally immoral. And I found a quote in an article, I think it was Penn State University newsletter, and the author of this quote is Kathleen Brown. She's the professor of history in the School of Arts and Sciences and a historian of gender and race in early America. So here's her quote. Some reasons for all the attention on abortion early on have to do with professional authority over women's bodies. Who really knows what's going on with women's bodies? And who has the authority to regulate these bodies? See the shift, right? This is the thinking in the time. So there was a general feeling among male, this is her quote continued, there's a general feeling among male academically trained practitioners that most of what women bring to bear on treatment of their bodies is suspect. It's not reliable. It's not trustworthy. Quote, they're considered old wives' tales. They're coming out of places of superstition and ignorance and a kind of outdated folk wisdom that doesn't have a place in modern medicine in the 19th century. So you can see the mindset. I'm not saying that there weren't unhealthy midwives. I'm not saying that there weren't wacky herbal healers. There were, but for the most part, their traditions that they carried on from generation to generation, woman to woman, worked. So there still was risk, there still was some danger, but for the most part, it worked. You got a recipe of an herbal treatment for the unblocking of your menstrual cycle from your grandmother or your great-grandmother. You can see how and so that was folk wisdom, but it worked. And it's from the beginning of time, women have been trying to control birth reproduction and have found things that worked globally around the world, different nations. So it's not new, but you can, I'm hoping you can see how the medical field, as it goes up, it's pushing down women. They were taking this freedom away of control of their own body, of an understanding of their own body. And the legislature was in on it with the doctors. Okay, so about 1860s, criminalization of abortion took off. States began passing laws banning the procedure. By 1880, most states had outlawed abortion. It really took off in 1873, which this is not part of this study, but it will be in part 2 in April.
Do you think that the Civil War that went on in the 1860s sort of promoted them to, I guess, block abortion? They wanted women to keep having children so they could send, their boys or train them for war.
Yes. Over 600,000 men died. I forget how many thousands were wounded, but that was a issue, especially around immigration and the nativists and immigration. And I talk on that briefly later on. But yeah.
Can I add another thing?
Sure,
Sorry,
Alyssa. Go ahead.
All right. So one thing that I came across the other day was how Black women are affected in this, because um, I was reading a story of this woman that was born in 1865, and a Black woman who was born free, and she learned midwifery from her mom. And at that time, I guess since 1808, 1809, somewhere in there, early 1800s, slavery was actually importing of slaves from Africa was outlawed. So the slave economy in the United States turned to domestic breeding, for lack of a better term, of Black people, of slaves. So the further outlawing of women discontinuing their periods was a huge, so that was impacting the slave economy. So they cracked down on that. By the time the emancipation came around, no medical treatment was available at all for Black people. So the midwives, Black midwives that were trained, they would go from town to town, helping
Nurses, yeah.
whoever they could. Yeah. And I just thought it was interesting how much more impacted the Black community is in this regard, and how little information there really is about it. It's all kind of word of mouth and folk stories passed down, put into books later. Like the grandmother died, or so the woman telling the story was the granddaughter of this woman that was born in 1865. She died in 1956. And so it was really interesting to hear stories that the granddaughter heard growing up.
Right. So that's actually my next topic, is about the enslaved Black women and what they were going through. So the doctors weren't trusting what white women were saying about their bodies, and that they were believing in this superstition of folklore, and some of it may have been that, but there were still things that did work. So these suspicious attitudes were actually doubly applied to enslaved Black women. There was intense interest in their reproduction, but rather pinning blame on the abortion when a pregnancy failed, the physicians tended to assume that enslaved women were incapable of ending their own pregnancies, which later on I'll prove that to be false. Instead, they pegged them as bad mothers, or they looked to the treatment of them by those who claimed to own them, the masters, and how hard they worked in the field or in the state of their living conditions. So James Moore, the author of Abortion in America, found evidence contrary to what the white doctors, male doctors, were thinking. And here's what he found: that enslaved women literally rebelled against the process of white supremacist patriarchy, and interfered with pregnancies, because slave breeding involved forced relationships between enslaved men and women, but it also involved rape by the white enslavers, the overseers, the slave drivers. And enslaved women found ways to resist with help from Black midwives. And there was like this form of womb liberation, is how he wrote it, by relying on networks of care, generational, women to women, within the plantation community. And they used herbal remedies, contraceptive methods, which is a lot of the douches and sponges that had things on it to cause irritation, and traditional knowledge. So it totally contradicts, you know, and it shows their racist thinking and their sexism and their patriarchal attitude, that they know everything. So thanks for adding in that, Alyssa, at perfect timing. So I'm gonna try and get going here a little. There's a second wave of anti-abortion laws, and that started 1840 to 1880. And because of the decrease in the price of paper, advertising expanded. And so now abortion is a visible social reality. It's in magazines because they were starting to come out, the Ladies' Home Journal and all these other things that were promoting stay-at-home moms and motherhood and all that. You would find literally ad after ad after ad after ad for herbal healers, helping with your menses, even just plain out abortion services. So this brought about a sharp increase in abortions. But what was shocking, as the doctors were finding out in this period, in the early days, it was generally only single women, ashamed women, who were having and seeking abortions. And so the physicians at the time would do it as a compassion, as a charity, because the young woman was seduced and, you know, she's infantile, she needs help, and patriarchal, okay, we're going to help her out. Well, they started getting really shocked when they started keeping track. And of course, now that they're organized, they have meetings, they write reports, they track the different things, especially abortion. And what they discovered was that white, married, Protestant, native-born women of upper and middle class were having abortions. And that rocked their boat. They were shocked. How could a Christian nation tolerate such a practice? So they were like blaming women and the feminists, that they were no longer wanting to be mothers. How could you do this? This is your role, your destiny. And you know, abortion was seen as a compassionate act in the beginning, but now it's turning into something that's less than. And of course, it's not, it's done now willfully. Women who already have children, they don't want more children. And so it broke that patriarchal infant woman scenario. They also noticed the birth rate in the United States was declining. Immigrant women were not having as many abortions as the native-born women. Abortions, like I said, were openly advertised. They offered preparations for your unblocking your menstrual flow. With these facts, they then went to the legislatures and they put in nativism now with their plea against to enact anti-abortion laws. We can't be replaced, right? We've got to keep the population going. But as much as they tried, still within the 1840s and 60s, the quickening doctrine remained essentially intact. Let me see, there was one in particular I wanted to point out. Okay, so in 1847, the state of Massachusetts passed a law against advertising publicly for an abortion. And they wanted to eliminate the market. They didn't want women to be able to find a source for getting an abortion, again, because they want to regulate this process. And again, it was going underground. So word of mouth would spread. If you couldn't advertise, then you had to do it a different way. So states started becoming more worried about the birth rates, how the families are being limited. And now keep in mind, there's a lot of other stuff happening in this time period, which is the Industrial Revolution. And people are moving off the farm where you need a lot of kids because you need labor. So people are now moving from the farm and into the cities and into the industrial work, and they don't need as many. And so there's just a lot of different aspects happening, you know, so we're not in a vacuum by any means. So what did they do? They started adding some of the states started adding about pre-quickening, and that was new. And they still went after, they were still annoyed by all the advertising, but they were cautious because the population was still okay with the quickening doctrine. So 1848, the women, first wave feminism. Now, interestingly, I'm only going to give a little bit. Victorian era had begun, had already been about 10 years by now. And there were different groups within the feminist movement when it started, but they still believed that women were purer than men and that the only purpose of sexual activity was reproduction. And so they really did not promote anti-abortion. But later on, we will talk about what they did promote, and that was in the 1870s. So just that little bit there, and it's a complex history too, because of all the different groups that they divided into, but they were united on some other topics, education, marriage, things like that. So in 1857, there's this man, I call him the John the Baptist for Anthony Comstock. He cleared the way, he laid out the road, flipped out the hills. His name is Horatio Storer, very religious man. He got the American Medical Association to campaign and make abortion illegal in the United States. Quote, he says, "We are the physical guardians of women." This was in his 1859 report on the criminal abortion. He goes, the case is here of life or death, and it depends almost wholly upon ourselves, the doctors. By 1860, more than 20 states had criminalized the procedure. So let me kind of scan here. I don't want to give everything. Okay, so the AMA adopted Storer's position against abortion as a way to establish physicians as the leading authority on women's health, as opposed to the care of midwives. He condemned women who provided health care, midwives, asserting the practice would remove women from what he called their proper and God-given sphere. So you can't be out of the home. So his goal was to sway public opinion. And he wanted them to be against abortion. And so he pushed for increased legal restrictions. So he said it was the physician's duty to suppress the practice of abortion wherever they could. And he advocated legislation that would recognize the rights of what he called the unborn child, which was the fetus. This was the first time that was used. he started placing more responsibility and criminal liability on women who chose to have an abortion. And he also, which is in contrast to previous legislation, which would put the responsibility on the physician, and the woman was immune. But he was really, he was so passionate. He wrote all the time. He was writing pamphlets and books, anti-abortion. He was using God. He was using the authority of the AMA, disparaging midwives and folk tales, and just pummeling the public with these new views. And so when the AMA made abortion one of their policies, Connecticut passed a law making it a felony, holding the woman and the physician for a criminalized act. So it's not a misdemeanor now, and it's not manslaughter. It's now a felony. This law from Connecticut became the standard for future legislation across the states in the United States. And of course, this is all state by state. Every state's doing its own thing, but they are on different levels on the issues of abortion and the punishment thereof. He wrote a pamphlet to married women in 1865, saying that abortion goes against natural instincts, morality, and the greater public interest. He argued that abortion was so dangerous that any woman who requested it, permitted it, or performed it must be insane. And he wrote that married women had a moral obligation to reproduce, stating that the Civil War had caused such devastating population losses. And like I said, he was a prolific writer and publisher of books against criminal abortion. Okay, 1870s. So the feminist movement had varied ideas on birth control, but the majority of them agreed on voluntary motherhood. And so if you have voluntary motherhood, what they are stating is we're opposed to involuntary motherhood. I mean, we want control over when we have children. They agreed on, even though there was like different organizations within the feminist movement in the first wave as to how to go about and what different strategies and all that, they were united on the major issues of marriage, the vote, education, and employment opportunity, things like that. And they also agreed on birth control, but not everybody agreed with the voluntary motherhood, but a good many of them did. They basically disapproved of, they disapproved and were fearful of contraception because they feared that it would permit fallen women to tempt their husbands, because now she's not going to get pregnant, because that was really what kept women in line, was the fear of getting pregnant. So the chastity thing helped keep that control on also. But their view of birth control was not by medicine or any kind of herbal remedy, but it was a period of abstinence. And their logic was the wife should have a right to refuse her husband. And that right was fundamental to the condition of birth control and her independence and her integrity. So they were blending that in to their women's rights. And but they still also believed that birth control was not for women to indulge in sexual intercourse without the intention of reproduction. So they still had this Victorian era thinking that biology is destiny and that's the women's role is to produce children. So they basically had strong sexual moral standards and they were pro-motherhood.
Can I add something real quick?
Sure.
I can't remember if you touched on Horatio Storer being a early eugenicist or not, but that's one thing that I remember from reading about him a while ago. And it seems that, so where you also wrote the systemic use by married white Protestant women, because that's the population that they're wanting to have more babies. So
Right.
like this anti-abortion scheme, I guess, seems to be kind of just another way for racial superiority to take hold.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly when eugenics came up. I know it was in the late 1800s, but in part two, because Margaret Sanger used eugenics as a scientific reason for birth control. So it is in there, but you can see basically even without eugenics per se, there was still nationalism, right? There was Christian American nationalism. And this is when they were the immigration of Irish Catholics, Germans, later on Chinese in California. And so they were all just really getting overwhelmed. And again, the patriarchal system says, no, we need to control and contain. But it may have been during Horatio Storer. I can't remember right offhand, but I'll take a peek at that. So basically, as we end here, women were trying to gain control over their bodies. And when you think about it in that era, that required, which this voluntary motherhood does, it required the rejection of motherhood as your primary vocation. That's huge. When you think of the sphere of the thought processes and the culture and the norm of that period. And not only was motherhood your primary vocation, it was your worthiness. That's how you found worthy. So to gain control of their own bodies required a change in the culture, and it also required other sources of employment and other sources of finding worthiness. So we see in this history, just this short history, compressed, sifted, of how abortion is coming to be banned and how women lost rights that previously were thought to be natural and inherent over their own bodies. And so we see the evidence of a patriarchal system and systems within that patriarchy and the domination of men over women. And that's all I have. Any thoughts or comments, questions?
Yeah,
For me-
experience. Oh, go on.
No, go ahead, Linda.
I was just going to say, you know, I was thinking back to my actual experiences back in the day, which some of which were not totally unlike yours. I went from having no control with my first pregnancy with a male doctor and inducing and everything, and went completely 180 degrees in the other direction. I thought I can do better than this. And I went for a midwife, very popular midwife through La Leche League. And I embraced the whole thing, you know, the whole La Leche League thing. And but the natural birth was so much better than the chemically induced option with, you know, all the, you know, all the old-fashioned ways that they had of doing things with, you know, women who were giving birth and everything. And it was like, you know, things are quicker the second time around anyway, but the whole idea that I had control. This was what I want to do it. I'm going to do it my way, not be surprised by what somebody's going to do.
Mhm.
I'm going to lay out exactly what's going to happen during this birth and who's going to do it and everything. And it was so much better. Yeah, just knowing control. So the natural childbirth thing can be a big improvement over,
It can,
yeah,
as long as there's no complications.
yeah.
You know, Lamaze does work.
Yeah.
I got through my first one. The second one, I had the medicine, and it scared me to death because I have no control. The
Mhm.
Lamaze didn't work, and I had to get through it. And the doctor literally, you know, when he saw me losing and panicking, he goes, "What's the matter with you? You've done this before."
Mhm.
I'm in too much pain to hit him, right? I mean,
Yeah.
ah,
I didn't even do the Lamaze thing. I didn't know what that was. Yeah. But just just being in it was a nice, like a natural birthing setting at a hospital with the woman I chose to do it, not some doctor I didn't know, which is how it ended up for me. I ended up not being able to use the doctor I chose and having to use some stranger. And the whole thing the first time around was like, oh, he just wants to get this over with. So they're going to induce, they think I'm late. And, you know, it's just you lose control from the moment that doctor takes control and makes decisions for you.
yeah.
And
Well,
the
thank
next
you.
time around, yeah.
Thank you for sharing. Anyone else?
Oh, I just want to say thank you. I found it very interesting. A lot of holes, you know, in my understanding of the history of things with women, you know, persecution, I call it. You know, it was very, very, it helped me a lot to understand better. You know, because I already knew that from my own experience. You know, I've had tons of male doctors that have just, you know, ignored me and actually harmed me, I feel. And I even kind of suspect that, you know, I was kind of messed with when I shouldn't have been in a certain way
Yeah.
as a teenager, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, I really liked hearing about all those, you know, how it was in history, and and I think it informed us a lot in the, you know, how it's come through the laws too. So thank you.
Thanks, Willen.
Really appreciated those. Thanks, Kathy.
I was looking up what, by the way, thank you. This has been really instructive and I enjoyed it quite a bit. I happened to look up about the fact that apparently the medical knowledge was lost that if a woman stopped her period, that she became pregnant. Because and I think it's an indictment on medicine in general, because this was known hugely in the past. Like the Egyptians knew this stuff, the Greeks, the Romans, they understood this. So why we lost that You know, it's kind of an indictment on Western, I don't know if it's patriarchy or whatever it is, but how they lost that is a kind of a mystery to me. But I pretty
Yeah.
much narrowed down. It must be some kind of cultural thing.
It was hard to believe that they hadn't connected that.
Yeah. Okay, that was just a little comment.
Okay, thank you, David.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Kathy.
Even though,
Oh, go ahead, Troy.
oh, thank you, Bob. Even though I'm distracted by my taking care of my son presently, what I drew from this, what I hear, because I'm in and out, I was able to see the tie between slavery and gender, abortion, controlling of course, the population.
Mhm.
So I see those two coming together more than I saw before. That's what I jumped out at me.
Thank you, Troy. There was actually written down back in the day, in that period, where the women who were fighting the system, but still having to live in it because, how's a woman going to make a living? She had to, for financial reasons, had to marry. And the pressure was there. But many of them actually said during this time when slavery is still there in the United States, that this marriage, this coverture thing was a form of slavery. They had no rights. So your analysis is, I believe, correct. It is a control of genders in both races, but then also of a complete race through slavery. But the women are the ones that are oppressed in
Yes.
sexual reproduction. Yeah. Thank you. I think Bob, you were going to have say something.
Yeah, and it's an indirect comment to this whole presentation you've done, but it's interesting to me that there's laws that they put on the books, and they could be from 100 years ago, 150 years ago, or whenever they are, and they never, in a sense, take out the trash. These laws just kind of go by the wayside, and other things take precedent. And then later on, if somebody wants to pick up these old laws, they say, well, this is a law, and they just run with it. And that's scary to me. And the other thing ties in with what you and Troy were just saying. I see that this whole issue of anti-abortion is deliberately done so that they can try to increase the populations of the people groups that they want to increase, because it all has to do with all this fight over race, relations and immigration, and who's going to be the one who's in the majority, as far as the population. And when you see the white population back then, diminishing, and all these immigrants coming in who aren't having abortions, then you can see that the whole thing is about manipulation and control. It just becomes obvious. Thank you.
For sure. It's just astounding to me when I was studying this to realize the actual premeditation of the history of the AMA at that time to make a concerted effort to go after women's health to control, and specifically using abortion, and then connecting to the legislatures. And that is a pattern that still exists today. So it's not new. We just have to look back and see. Basically, 1800s pre-quickening freedom for women was what women got in 1973 with Roe v. Wade. They had up to, I think, 22 weeks, which was a time period they established. So that's how many years? But it was in the 1800s that they really started putting the hammer down. So we'll, in the next study, we'll pick up and get into more details with Anthony Comstock and more American policies, Supreme Court decisions. And so that'll be an interesting ride too. Anyone else? Okay, well, let's just go ahead and close in prayer. Holy God, we thank you for this Sabbath day. We thank you for your blessings upon us. Thank you for your presence among us. We ask for your leading and your guidance and your teaching to help us to understand these things in a prophetic way, to see the history from the beginning, that it may help us understand not only the past history, but present and possibly the future. We are grateful for this opportunity to gather, to worship together, to study together. We praise you and thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks, everybody.